Hello everyone, I'm Nitahone, and guess what? The full spoiler for Dominaria went up a day earlier than expected, so the full set limited review actually begins today. I originally thought it was going to start tomorrow, but it's starting today. If you haven't been around for this before, when a new set gets spoiled, I spent an entire week talking about the new limited format to help us all get ready to play it. For the next several days, I will be doing videos color by color, and I will also be doing a guide to all the archetypes in the format and a video on the top 10 bombs. There are a few caveats to get out of the way. First, obviously, I'm doing this before actually playing with any of these cards. I've played with a few with the reprints, but it's a different format, so that doesn't mean it's perfect. Generally, I do an okay job on these reviews. On average, I'm wrong about around 10% of the cards in the format, which I think is pretty good. Nobody can perfectly predict how cards are going to perform in a format without actually playing with them. I'll do a video, several weeks down the road after I've drafted the format like 30 times and talk about what I got wrong. That's what I always do. I always love this time, and I'm really excited about this new format. Before we get started, if you want to know how I grade these cards, you can follow a link in the description below that explains it. Now, let's get started with white. First up, we have Adamant Will, which for 1 generic and 1 white is a common instant that says target creature gets +2/+2 and gains indestructible until end of turn. This is a pretty good combat trick because it can be used in multiple situations effectively. You can use it to help one of your creatures win in combat, but you can also use it to blank a removal spell. Stats boost plus indestructible tricks are nice, especially at 2 or less converted mana cost. I think this will be the premier combat trick for aggressive white decks. I don't think we're going to be seeing a better combat trick in this particular video. That said, it's still a trick, and tricks are only good in aggressive decks and they have their risks. If you cast this when your opponent has mana up, you are really risking a 2-for-1. For me, solid playable tricks have a hard time getting out of the C range, but that's a pretty solid grade for a trick, and that's what I'm going to give this, a C. You'll be fine playing 1 or 2 of these in most of your white decks, assuming they are aggressive. Next up, we have Auvinen Sentry, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 creature, a bird soldier with flying. Not the most exciting of cards, but it's fine. Auvinen Sentry does an okay job on the French vanilla test as a 4-mana 3/2 flyer. It's about what we really expect these days, at least in a common. This is the kind of middling card that will make the cut in your deck more often than it won't, but you won't be excited about it ever, and for me, that makes this a pretty standard C. Next, we have Baird, Steward of Archive, which is 2 generic and 2 white for a 2/4 legendary creature, human soldier at uncommon. That's right, there are lots of legendary creatures at uncommon in this set. It's one of the set's themes is legendary creatures. He has vigilance, and creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their opponent pays 1 for each of those creatures. This is pretty great. A 4-mana 2/4 with vigilance is already a passable creature. Not a good one, but a passable one. Adding a mini Ghostly Prison effect makes it great, and it of course gets some extra bonuses because it's a legendary creature. We'll see some triggers that care about legendary creatures and historic permanents. More on that later, and obviously he helps trigger those things. He's a solid B. I think he's more of a defensive card, but even in an aggro deck, it can help you win a race by slowing down your opponent's attacks. I think you feel pretty solid about first picking this guy. Next, we have Banal Honor Guard, which for 1 generic and 1 white is a 2/2 human knight at common. And it says Banal Honor Guard gets +1/+0 for each legendary creature you control. So immediately after Baird, we have a legendary payoff. This is a fine little 2-drop with some upside. A 2-mana 2/2 on its own is nothing special, but it's the kind of thing you run when you're short on 2-drops. But if you can make this a 3/2 or a 4/2, neither of which is anything crazy, it gets a lot better. It will not only attack harder, but also be able to trade up when it blocks. Most decks in the format are probably going to have at least a handful of legendaries, so I don't feel like this is a build-around. It's just a 2-drop with some upside, the kind that you will rarely want to cut from your white deck, assuming you have at least a few legendary creatures, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, we have Alicia Marshall, which for 3 white mana, is a creature, human knight at rare, and it says other creatures you control get +1/+1, and he is a 3/3. There is a whole cycle of creatures like Alicia Marshall. That is, cards that cost 3 mana of 1 color. Like all of them, this has a difficult mana cost, but a powerful effect. A 3-mana 3/3 that pumps your whole team is a great rate, but you really can't count on casting this on turn 3 in most decks. You would need to be monocolored or at least running like 12 or more planes to feel good about that, and that just isn't where you usually end up in Limited. That mana cost definitely holds this card back, though the fact that it has a relevant creature type does matter a little bit, although it's mostly rares that care about the knight creature type, and the fact that it is good at any stage of the game, thanks to the anthem it brings with it, still makes it a pretty good card despite the mana requirements, and I'm going to give it a B-. I think you do first pick this guy in packs that don't have like premium removal, and you feel fine about it. Obviously, you can't count on casting him on turn 3, but he is good no matter what. If you can play him on turn 5, turn 6, his text box is still going to matter. So he's a solid card for first picking, and I'm giving him that B-. Next, we have Blessed Light, which for 4 generic and 1 white is a common instant that says exile target creature or enchantment. This is clunky, but effective removal. For 4 mana, this can kill just about any creature in the format, and even get around cards that do things in the graveyard. On top of that, it can also deal with problem enchantments, and there are lots of those in this format thanks to the presence of sagas, which we'll get to later if you don't know what those are. To be fair, generally blowing up a saga with this isn't going to feel good, especially because most of the time they're going to cost a lot less than 5 mana that you have to pay for this, and because by the time you blow it up, your opponent will have already gotten 1 chapter out of their saga in most cases, so you're blowing something up and they've already gotten some value out of it. So it's not quite a 2-for-1, but it's not going to feel good. Still though, sometimes you have to blow up a saga because its chapter 3 is so powerful. And that's not a knock against this card. It's just flexible because it can do it, and I just want to make it clear that while it's nice against sagas, it's not like a silver bullet against them because they're still going to get some value out of it. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that it is a serviceable removal spell, but certainly not premium. You'll run this in your white decks, but there are other removal spells you'd rather have, and you certainly don't want to be taking this with the first pick. All of that makes this a C+ in my book. Next, we have Board the Weatherlight, which for 1 generic and 1 white is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a historic card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, as this reminder text tells you, artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic. There's a lot of all 3 of those things in this format, so generally you'll be able to hit something with Board the Weatherlight. But I mostly don't like cards like this anyway. 2 mana for some card selection isn't bad, and sure you can construct a deck where you're going to get a card with this all the time, but I want an effect like this attached to a small creature or something like Glintnest Crane, which we saw in the recent past. There are times where you will run this, especially if you have a deck loaded with historic bombs and it can dig you that much closer, but most of the time I think this is best to steer clear of, as you're just going to be spending 2 mana and spinning your wheels. I'm going to give it a D-. Next, we have Call the Cavalry, which for 3 generic and 1 white is a common sorcery, and it says create 2 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance. This is a good common. It helps you go wide, which is something some white decks will want to do, a lot of white decks will want to do, and it's just very efficient. Even if your deck isn't about going wide, it gives you 4/4 worth of power and toughness with vigilance across 2 creatures for 4 mana. In a lot of formats, I feel like that would be an uncommon, but here it's a common, and I want to be playing this card. Sign me up for it. This is one of White's best commons. I think it's a C+. It could be even better than that. I can sort of see first picking this in a weaker pack, so maybe it's even a B-, but it's definitely one of White's best commons, and it's close to a B-, even if it's not quite there. Next, we have Charge, which for 1 white mana is a common instant that says creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is cheaper than we usually see these effects. This format looks like it has creatures who can go wide, like with Call the Cavalry, which we just saw, and this can help inflict a bunch of damage, and it can also be used as a trick to get some nice trades or even just blowouts if your opponent's trying to trade with your guys, but it still isn't great. It's just a solid C. This is because it can be a useless card in so many situations, and you really need to be getting there on a go-wide token strategy for it to be at its best, and neither of those can be guaranteed, so you don't want to take this early at all. Our next card is the Auvinen Trapper, which for 2 generic and 1 white is a 3/2 human archer at common, and whenever you cast a historic spell, tap target creature an opponent controls. So this is another historic payoff. There are a lot of those in this set, and this one is pretty good. A 3 mana 3/2 isn't great on the vanilla test, but it's fine, and tapping down creatures when you cast historics... A 3 mana 3/2 isn't great on the vanilla test, but it's fine, and tapping down creatures when you cast historic spells is a nice thing to add to it. Obviously, this is something of a build-around. If you only have a few historic cards in your deck, she's probably like a D+. If you have, let's say, 7 or more, she probably moves all the way up to a C+. She's a solid common payoff for historic, but not the kind you should pick up early. This is the kind of payoff you take once it is clear that you're going to make the best use of her. Next, we have Denitha Capuchin Paragon, which for 2 generic and 1 white is a 2/2 legendary creature, human knight at uncommon, and, get ready, she has First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink, and aura and equipment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Sure sounds like a rare in most formats, right? We're going to be seeing a decent amount of that in this set. There's a lot of crazy legendary creatures, especially at uncommon, and this is one of those. She's good because she's good even in a deck with 0 equipment or auras. The keyword abilities and the 2/2 body she brings you is well worth 3 mana, and that is without going into potential legendary and historic upside, because she does help trigger things that care about that. She's the kind of card I will give 2 grades though, since she's going to be better in equipment and aura heavy decks, which will usually be red-white, it looks like, and I think she's probably a C+ in a limited deck with 0 auras or equipment. But with every aura or equipment you add to your deck, she gets better, not only because she decreases the cost of them, but also because she's a great place to put them, thanks to all of her keyword abilities. I'm going to give her a solid B in a deck that has 5 or more auras and equipment, and that's not an insane number of things to have. And I think she's actually worth first picking. Usually a B- is where I start saying something's worth first picking, but when this card has a really good ceiling and a reasonable floor, I think it's worth first picking in packs that are, you know, middling or weak. She's going to be a decent first pick, and you certainly take her like second, third, fourth a lot of the time, just because she's good in any deck. Those stats are relevant in any deck. She can block well, she can attack well, she can gain you life, and if you happen to have auras and equipments, she gives you a ton of upside. Next, we go to Daring Archaeologist, which for 3 generic and a white is a human artificer at rare and a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand, and it says whenever you cast a historic spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Daring Archaeologist. Obviously, this Archaeologist is at its best when you have an artifact buried in your graveyard, since if you do, it's an automatic 2-for-1. But even if you don't have an artifact in your graveyard, you're playing a creature who is a pretty great historic payoff. Artifacts, legendaries, and sagas, again, occur all over this format. We've seen a few legendaries already. We will see more, and we'll see, when we get to the artifact video, a ton of artifacts. But there's lots of ways to get artifacts back from your graveyard. I mean, artifacts to play to get back from your graveyard with the Archaeologist, and there's lots of historic spells running around. However, if your deck is short on artifacts and or historic spells, this is probably only a C+. However, I think in a lot of limited decks, you'll get, like getting 7 historic spells isn't an insane number or anything, and I think she gets a B+ in decks like that. Which means, sort of like the Natha Capuchin, this is worth considering first picking because it has an incredibly high ceiling and a perfectly reasonable floor. I mean, a 4-mana 3/3 on its own isn't great, but, you know, if you can even get 1 counter on it or return an artifact from your graveyard with it, you're getting your money's worth for this 4-mana 3/3 already. So it's a really good card. I think it's going to be first pickable a lot of the time. Next, we have Dauntless Bodyguard, which for 1 white mana is a 2/1 human knighted uncommon, and it says, as it enters the battlefield, choose another creature you control. And that also has an activated ability, sacrifice Dauntless Bodyguard. The chosen creature gains indestructible until end of turn. Savannah Lions continues to look bad compared to today's 1 white mana 2/1s. And most 1 white mana 2/1s aren't that great in draft because most 1-drops can trade with them. This does come with some additional upside that makes it relevant in the late game though. If you choose your best creature and go to combat, your opponent is going to have some really annoying decisions to make. Still, I don't think you take this all that early, though you'd probably take it in any white deck, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, we have Dub, which for 2 generic and 1 white is an enchantment aura at common, and it says, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2, has first strike, and is a knight in addition to its other types. So auras were just really good in Ixalan, and I underrated a bunch because normally they're not that good. In this set, there are some aura payoffs, so auras are still a little bit better than usual, I think, in this format. That said, Dub still doesn't seem like anything special to me. Yes, it gives a pretty nice stats boost, but I don't like auras that don't give you some sort of value, even in a world where your creature dies, and this doesn't give that to you. It gives a nice stats boost, and the knight thing isn't irrelevant, but I'm going to start this at C-. It just doesn't do enough for me as an aura to be the kind that I want to shove in every white deck I make. It will mostly make the cut in decks that have aura synergies. Next up, we have Evra, Halcyon Witness, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 4/4 legendary creature avatar at rare, has lifelink, and for 4 generic mana, you can exchange your life total with Evra Halcyon Witness's power. So this is mostly a 6-mana 4/4 with lifelink, which isn't great. Exchanging your life total with her power seems really great, but I think people will overrate that. She still only has 4 toughness when you do that, and yeah, it does make it so that she trades with most stuff in most stages of the game while also gaining you some life, but with no evasive ability to speak of, she's just going to die in her first swing in most cases. What's more is your opponent could let the activated ability resolve and then kill Evra, so I basically don't think you can ever use this activated ability if your opponent has mana that can kill Evra in play and it's untapped. Because in that case, you're dropping your life total to 4, and then she's gone. So she's very risky to use that activated ability. There's just a lot that can go wrong here with Evra. If you give her evasion somehow, she'll be a menace, but without it, she's just a clunky creature with a sometimes risky activated ability, and I'm going to give her a C+. Next up, we have Excavation Elephant, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/5 elephant at common. It has a kicker cost of 1 generic and 1 white, and kicker is an additional cost you can pay for a spell, and then it gives you some sort of bonus. In this case, when Excavation Elephant enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. A 5 mana 3/5 does an okay job on the vanilla test, but the real value here is in its flexibility. For 5 mana, it can give you decent stats, and for 7, it can get you an artifact back from your graveyard, essentially guaranteeing you get a 2-for-1. Still, not all decks will have enough artifacts to take advantage of this, so I think it's another build around. It's probably a D+ in a deck that only has a few artifacts, and it moves all the way up to a solid C, a card you feel fine about playing in a deck that has enough artifacts for you to get back. And just a note on these common creatures, I know it doesn't sound efficient to pay 7 mana for a 3/5 and get the artifact back, but the real strong thing about a lot of these commons that have kicker is the flexibility. So you can play this on turn 5 and have a reasonable creature in play, and then you can play it on turn 7 and get some extra value out of it. Almost none of the common creatures with kicker we'll be seeing are like efficient. You're not pumped to pay the amount of mana that you pay for it and the kicker cost, but the flexibility is what you're really paying for here, and that's some nice additional things you can do in the late game with some additional mana, is get back an artifact from your graveyard. So I like Excavation Elephant reasonably. Obviously you don't take it early, but you'll play it in your decks that have a few, more than a few, have several artifacts in them. Next we have Fall of the Thran, which is our first saga. For 5 generic and a white, it is an enchantment saga at rare. And when a saga enters and after your draw step, you add a lore counter to it. And each lore counter takes you to another chapter. The little Roman numerals here are each a chapter. You know, the flavor here is that it's sort of the story of an event in Dominaria's past. And it's actually really cool too, because the artwork depicted on all of the sagas are all artwork that's supposed to exist in Dominaria that people have created as a way of remembering the past, which I think is pretty cool. I guess as a historian, maybe that's why I'm into it. But anyway, chapter 1 on this destroys all lands, and then chapter 2 and 3 say each player returns 2 land cards from their graveyard to the battlefield. Destroy all lands effects are actually at their best in more aggressive decks, since if you get ahead on board and your opponent has a hand packed with cards, blowing up all their lands really puts them in an ugly place. Sure, you can also use it in a more controlling deck if you get your bomb out and your opponent is sort of spinning their wheels, but most of the time in a more aggressive deck is going to want this, I think. You and your opponent both get back some lands after you do this, but if you are ahead on board, they will be dead before that matters. Still, this is a pretty narrow effect, as you need to be ahead on board already for it to really be worth it. If you get this when you're behind, it's just bad, and at parity, it doesn't do much. I'm going to give this a C, and I could see it going even lower. Next, we have Gideon's Reproach, which for 1 generic and 1 white is a common instant, and it says, Gideon's Reproach deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. This is a reprint, and last time we saw it, it was pretty good. While it is situational and can't kill creatures with 4 or more toughness without some additional help, it's efficient enough at 2 mana that those downsides are worth it. And honestly, while situational, since it allows you to kill things that are attacking or blocking, it isn't that situational, since attacking and blocking are the bread and butter of many a limited format. This gets really devastating when you use it in response to a combat trick, since you are then getting a 2-for-1 for only 2 mana, and trust me, that's going to happen to all of us. Overall, I think the somewhat narrow target for the removal spell are overcome by the fact that it is incredibly efficient, and I think it is another one of White's best commons. You probably feel okay about first picking it out of a weaker pack, and I think that gives it a B-. I don't know if I would use the word premium removal to describe this, but it's about as close as you can get to it. I think it's sort of like one rung below that, but it is a good removal spell, and you'll play a couple of them in any White deck. Next, we have Healing Grace, which for 1 white mana is a common instant, and it says, prevent the next 3 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn by a source of your choice. You gain 3 life. Take that, Healing Salve. The worst card in the boon cycle has now been strictly upgraded by a card that just does both things that the Salve gives you the option to do, and funnily enough, it still isn't that great, even like this upgraded Healing Salve. Preventing damage is kind of nice because it can be flexible. You can blank a burn spell, you can save a creature in combat, but good combat tricks are the kind that make your creature big enough to take down another creature, and that can happen here in a situation where you or your opponent are trying to trade only, but it still isn't anything special, and I'm going to start it at D+. Next, we have History of Benaglio, which for 1 generic and 2 white is an enchantment saga at Mythic Rare. And again, you know, it gets a saga counter when the turn it comes into play, right after it comes into play, and then it gets another one after your draw step. So this one creates a 2/2 White Knight creature token with Vigilance, so the turn you play it for 3 mana, you get that. The next turn, you get another one of those 2/2 white knight creature tokens with Vigilance. So you're paying 3 mana to get 2/2/2 knights, which is already a great rate. And then Chapter 3 gives all knights you control +2/+1 until end of turn. This is one of the few cards in the set that has knight payoffs. Most of them are at rare or mythic, and this is a mythic that has it. But the nice thing is, it doesn't really matter if you have more knights in play or not. Just thinking about the fact of playing this on turn 3, getting a 2/2 white knight, and then on turn 3 you get another one. Maybe on turn 4 you get another one, and then maybe on turn 4 you play another random creature. Maybe it's a knight. But even if you don't play another knight, on turn 3 those 2 knight tokens are now 4/3s with Vigilance. It's only for a turn, but that is huge, and this card is incredibly aggressive. Overall, I think this is a great card, one you should be pretty happy to first pick. All that said, it's pretty surprising to me that this card is a mythic rare. It doesn't really feel like one, and while it's good at all stages of the game because it's going to give you a couple knight tokens, as the game goes on, it gets less good, unless you have a board just filled with knights, which could happen, and then it gets to be pretty good because it can let you break through a board stall. But if you just have these 2 knights in play, by the later part of the game, it's going to be fine, but not great. And I think because of that, it sort of misses out on bomb status. I think that gives it a B+ still. As close as you can get to being a bomb without being a bomb, and I think you still first pick this over basically every common and uncommon in the set anyway. There may be a few exceptions now that I said that, but there aren't a lot of them. So, History of Benaglio, very good, first pickable almost all the time. If you see it, you should probably take it. Next, we have Invoke the Divine, which for 2 generic and 1 white is a common instant that says destroy target artifact or enchantment. You gain 4 life. Here is the obligatory sideboard card for white that can blow up artifacts or enchantments. There are enough artifacts and enchantments in this set that mainboarding this won't feel that bad. It can take down sagas before they become problematic, and there's lots of artifacts running around. But it is probably still a D as a mainboard card. However, basically every time you're playing white, you probably want to pick one of these up for your sideboard, and chances are it will come in at least once during your matches. I think it's a C+ out of your sideboard. Next, we have Knight of Grace, which for 1 generic and 1 white is a 2/2 human knight uncommon. It has first strike, and it has hexproof from black. And it says Knight of Grace gets +1/+0 as long as any player controls a black permanent. So this card is a nice callback to old knights in Magic's history that hated on black creatures, and this does a good job of that. Black removal can't target it, and it even gets bigger against opponents who have black permanents, but a 2-mana 2/2 with first strike is already good, and you'll be mainboarding this 90% of the time, and it'll be plenty good even if you never play someone who's playing black. Keep in mind also that if you were the one with a black permanent, that also makes this a 3/2 as easily as it does if your opponent has one. So this is actually sort of a signpost uncommon for black-white combined with the black knight that does this, and it's going to be probably at its best in a black-white deck because it'll frequently be a 3/2. I'm going to give this a C+. Next, we have Knight of New Benaglio, which for 1 generic and 1 white is a 3/1 human knight at common, and that's it. It's just a vanilla 2-mana 3/1 with a bunch of flavor text. 2-mana 3/1s are solid and limited, and this one has a creature type that will occasionally be relevant. She's perfectly solid, but also the kind of 2-drop you will cut in favor of more impactful cards pretty regularly, and I'm going to give her a C- because of that. Next up, we have Quinday, Pride of Femoris. For 3 generic and a white, it is a 2/2 legendary creature, human knight at uncommon. He's got double strike, and creatures you control with first strike have double strike. A 4-mana 2/2 with double strike is okay, and upgrading all your first strikers to double strikers is very good, but it is hard to really draft around this and have it work out. He isn't bad, but he isn't good either. Obviously, if you end up with a deck that somehow has like 10 first strike creatures in it, he'll be ridiculous, but I'm going to start him at a seed to reflect how likely it is I think that you can actually build around him. Next, we have Lyra Dawnbringer. This is good to combine with Quinday, that's for sure, but yeah, this thing's nuts. A 5-mana 5/5 with flying, first strike, and lifelink would basically already be an A, and it's basically Serra Angel, which was an incredibly powerful card. But on top of that, it pumps all your other angels and gives them lifelink. Now, there aren't a ton of angels running around in this format, but there's enough that will be relevant from time to time. Lifelink and flying together are quite powerful because it makes it very hard for your opponent to win a race when every time Lyra hits, you get a 10 life point difference between you and your opponent. She's a solid A, she's one of the biggest bombs in the format, and you should always first pick her, pretty much. Next up, we have Mesa Unicorn, which for 1 generic and 1 white is a 2/2 unicorn at common with lifelink. 2 mana 2/2s with lifelinks are normally not anything special, though in Triple Ixalan we did have that vampire with lifelink, and he was better than normal because of the tribal upside he brought. Mesa Unicorn doesn't have any of that. Instead, it is just a 2/2 with lifelink. Now, there is a little bit of upside to be had if you are playing a deck with aura and equipment. Again, red-white looks like the most likely place to do that, as lifelink does scale super well with auras and equipment, but I'm going to start it at C. It's a serviceable 2-drop that usually makes the cut, but you should never go after it anywhere close to early. Next up, we have On Serra's Wings, which for 3 generic and a white is a legendary enchantment aura at uncommon. There are legendary enchantments running around. It has enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature is legendary, gets +1/+1, has flying, vigilance, and lifelink. This is an aura that I like somewhat, but I'm also wary of it. It just doesn't do enough. Sure, yeah, it gives some nice keywords and a stats boost, and it is legendary, which is relevant in this format. But this still doesn't really do enough at 4 mana in most situations. This format could end up being crazy aggressive, and then this would be a little better. But I'm going to start it in the middle of the road at a C, with the caveat that decks really into playing auras will probably be running this all of the time. I just, 4 mana is a huge investment, and sure, if you have a creature in play that's already a decent size, giving it evasion like this is excellent. But there's going to be board states where you just don't have anywhere good to put this, and there's going to be times when your opponent just kills your creature in response, and then you're not only 2 for 1, you paid 4 mana and got 2 for 1. But still, it's playable because it has so much upside. I'm not trying to say it's not. I'm just explaining. I think some people will see this and think it's incredible, and, I could be wrong. I was wrong about a lot of auras in Triple Ixalan, but, I am saying this is playable, just not a card that you want to take anywhere remotely early. Next up, we have Pegasus Courser, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/3 Pegasus at common. It has flying, and when it attacks, another target attacking creature gains flying until end of turn. This is another quality common for white. A 3 mana 1/3 with flying isn't very good, but being able to give other attacking creatures flying is an ability that has proven to be quite strong. That makes this Pegasus relevant at all stages of the game, despite being a 3-drop creature with only 1 power. It can present a fast clock in the air, even if you just have a 3/3 or something attacking with it. None of that makes this a common you want to be first picking or anything, but I imagine that basically every white deck wants this, and it is probably one of the better commons in the color. I basically think you never cut this, really, at least not the first 2, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Sanctum Spirit, which for 3 generic and 1 white is a 3/2 spirit at uncommon with lifelink, and it has an activated ability that says, discard a historic card, Sanctum Spirit gains indestructible until end of turn. This card is going to be incredibly obnoxious to play against. A 4 mana 3/2 with lifelink isn't a great card on its own. It's something like let's say a D+. But the fact that this can gain indestructible is a huge problem. If your opponent is holding on to cards, and they should be if they're playing this spirit, it is incredibly risky to try to use removal on this, or block it, or attack into it, assuming the 3 power this thing has can kill your guys in combat. You really only feel comfortable blocking it or attacking into it in situations where you have a creature with 4 or more toughness, but there are going to be plenty of board states where that just isn't the case. It is, however, another build around. In a deck that is short on historic cards, it isn't going to be very good, something like a D+. But the good news is, even if you're short on historic cards, your opponent has to respect the fact that for all they know, you have an historic card in your hand. So it does, even if you don't have that many historic cards, the threat of activation here is very real. But the good news is, getting historic cards isn't that hard in the format. It's a broad enough category that making this reach its full potential won't be too hard, and it's probably a C+ in a deck that can really take advantage of that activated ability. Next, we have Selah Way, which for 1 generic and 1 white is an uncommon enchantment with flash, and it says, when Selah Way enters the battlefield, exile target tapped creature an opponent controls until Selah Way leaves the battlefield. This is a premium removal spell. It is situational, but not insanely so. A creature just has to be tapped, and this can take it down, even if it's indestructible. This is premium removal that you should take early. I'm going to start it at a B. It's the best removal spell in white in this format, I think. Next up, we have Sergeant at Arms, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 human soldier at common. It's another common with kicker. You can pay 2 generic and a white, and if you do, it enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. I like this card a lot. It's a good design. A 3 mana 2/3 is pretty close to what you expect to get, especially in white, and in the late game, it can also make you a couple of soldier tokens. As is the case with a lot of these common cards with Kicker, it's not that efficient. Playing 6 mana for a 2/3 and 2 1/1 soldier tokens wouldn't be bad, but it wouldn't be that good either. If that's all this card was, it would be like a, I don't know, maybe a C, C minus. But the idea, again, is the nice flexibility this gives you. In the early game, you can play him if you need an attacker or a blocker, you have an aura you need to put on something. And then in the late game, he can help you go wide. And when you're paying that 6 mana and getting 3 bodies, that's the kind of, that's a good deal-ish. I know I just said it wasn't a good deal, but it's an okay deal for 6 mana because you're going to get 3 bodies that, if you're behind, can help you survive a little longer, and if you're ahead, can help you push through your opponent's board. This is another excellent common for white. I think it's another C+. Next up, we have Serra Angel, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 4/4 angel at uncommon with flying and vigilance. Of course, one of Magic's oldest cards. She's back, and she's always good. Ever since she's been an uncommon, she's one of the best ones in white. She can just take over a game in the air, smashing for 4 while also being able to block efficiently, and she's just a great deal for 5 mana. What's more is there's some minor angel upside in the set, very minor, really, Lyra Dawnbringer. And she wields equipment and auras really well, which is a more significant sub-theme in the set. She is first pickable at uncommon, and I'm going to give her a B. I think you take Selah Way over her. I know I gave them both Bs, but I think Selah Way being premium removal is still a little better than the Angel, but it's close. I mean, that's how good Serra Angel is. Next, we have Serra Disciple, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 bird cleric at common with flying and first strike, and when you cast a historic spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. A 2 mana 1/1 with flying and first strike is not great, mostly because it can get quickly outclassed and it just doesn't hit hard enough in the air. However, this is a payoff for historic spells, which there are a lot of in this format, so it will frequently be attacking as a 2/2 and sometimes larger. That said, when you run out of gas, it will quickly turn into a 1/1, but it is a good place to put equipment and auras thanks to its evasiveness and first strike. Because it fits into so many different decks, and not just historic ones, I think that this avoids getting a build-around grade. That said, it doesn't have a huge ceiling or anything, and I think this is just a middle-of-the-road C. Next, we have Shalai, Voice of Plenty, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/4 legendary creature angel at rare. It has flying, and it says you, planeswalkers you control, and other creatures you control have hexproof. And for 4 generic and 2 green, it says put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. There's a whole cycle of these ally-colored rares that have an activated ability of 1 color and a casting cost in another, and most of them are pretty good. In this case, this one's very good, maybe the best in the cycle. A 4 mana 3/4 with flying is already a really good creature, and probably like a B-. Give me all the other text this has on it, and it becomes incredible. Even if you're not playing green and you're only getting the hexproof clause out of it, that's pretty nice. You're making your opponent have to kill her before they can kill anything else, and if they don't have a way to kill something with 4 toughness, like if their removal is better at killing small creatures, they're going to be in a really bad place. But if you're playing green, she gets truly insane as she can pump your entire board with a nice mana sink ability. I think that even if you're just playing white, she's probably like an A-. Maybe that's a little generous, maybe only a B+. But if you're playing green, she's basically an A+. She just gets to be completely insane. Next up, we have Tushar, Ancestor's Apostle, which for 3 generic and a white is a legendary creature bird cleric at rare. It's a 2/2 with flying, and it says whenever you cast a historic spell, return target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So a 4 mana 2/2 with flying is below what you want to pay, but this has a very, very powerful historic trigger that lets you return small creatures from your graveyard to your battlefield every time you cast an artifact, saga, or legendary card. And again, you're going to have a few of those in your deck without even trying. It is still a build-around, though. It asks you to both have lots of creatures with low converted mana cost and a lot of historic cards in your deck. The good news is some cards are going to be both of those things, and those will be especially good with Tushar. I think this is something like a C+ in a deck that just has a few historic cards, and a solid B when you have several of them. I don't think this is too bad to take in the early going, maybe even with the first pick, because it has a reasonable floor, since, again, no matter what, you're going to get a few historic cards, and it will get a lot stronger in a deck that really gets there on a nice combination of smaller creatures and a high volume of historic cards. Next, we have Tragic Poet, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human at common, and you can tap it and sacrifice it to return an enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. This card is pretty useful in this format. It can return sagas and auras, and both are all over the place in this format. Still, it's basically an F in a deck that doesn't have several enchantments, and a C when it really gets there. So only pick this up after you feel like you're going to be playing enchantments. It has a terrible floor and not the highest ceiling ever. Next up, we have Triumph of Gerard, which for 1 generic and 1 white is another enchantment saga. This one is uncommon. In Chapter 1, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control with the greatest power. You do the same thing in Chapter 2, and then Chapter 3 gives the creature you control with greatest power flying, first strike, and lifelink until end of turn. These saga cards are admittedly somewhat difficult to judge because we haven't had them before. That said, this one seems pretty good to me. A 2-mana investment that adds +2/+2 to the board, has a historic card type, and there are cards that care about that, as we've seen, and makes your biggest creature into an even more problematic threat is something I'll be down for in any deck with about 15 creatures. It still isn't incredible, and sometimes Chapter 3 on this won't really do anything, and the fact that you don't get to choose where to put the counters is also a bit of a bummer, but still, this is a solid little card for aggro decks, and I'm going to give it a C+. And now we arrive at our last card, and that is Urza's Ruinous Blast, which for 4 generic and a white is a legendary sorcery at rare. There's a whole cycle of these. And a legendary sorcery means you can only cast it if you control a legendary creature or a planeswalker. All of them have that clause, obviously. They're all legendary sorceries, but they all do something pretty powerful that is a good payoff for you only being able to cast it sometimes. In this case, you get to exile all non-land permanents that aren't legendary. So, yeah, this takes some setup, but with the number of legendary creatures in the set, it shouldn't be too hard to make happen. Obviously, you're going to get to keep whatever legendary permanents you have that is allowing you to cast this, and you get to decide when to cast it, so you can cast it when it has maximum impact. That said, the very thing that makes the setup on this not too difficult also makes this card less good when it would otherwise be. There are lots of legendaries. You aren't always going to kill what you need to with this. Still, it'll blow up most stuff, and, the upside is great. I think it's a good first pick. I'm going to give it a B+. Obviously, legendary permanents, creatures and planeswalkers only, I guess, increase in value a little bit when you know that you took Urza's Ruinous Blast early. Well, that does it for this limited review. I've talked about every single white card in the format and my first impressions. In the comments, let me know where you think I'm wrong, where you think I'm right. It's always good to talk about these new formats because that's what helps us all get better. Tune in tomorrow to see the next full set limited review video, which will be over blue. Thanks for watching.